The economic landscape of North America has been shaken by an unexpected move from Canada. The nation has effectively locked down its steel supplies, creating ripples across both sides of the US-Canada border. In a bold decision, Ottawa chose to halt the export of steel to the United States, a move that has set the stage for a dramatic shift in the continent's industrial and economic dynamics. As a result, President Donald Trump's recent tariffs on steel and aluminum now face an unintended consequence: Canada's new steel policy. For years, Canada has been a major supplier of steel to the US, feeding the factories of Detroit and other manufacturing hubs. However, when the US imposed its 30% tariffs on steel imports, Ottawa was forced to reassess its role in this cross-border supply chain. What followed was a decisive and unexpected action. Ottawa declared that Canadian steel would be prioritized for domestic use. By announcing that steel products such as automotive-grade cold-rolled coils, sheet metal, and profile pipes would no longer flow freely to the US, Canada threw a wrench into Washington's plans. The move was as much a political statement as an economic one, signaling Canada's unwillingness to be at the mercy of Washington's protectionist policies. In essence, Canada's decision is a direct response to the imposition of tariffs that made Canadian steel exports uncompetitive in the US market. The rationale was clear. Ottawa believed that by redirecting steel for domestic consumption, it could counterbalance the loss of export revenue. With steel plants like those in Hamilton already operating at full capacity, Canada was in a prime position to shift its focus to meeting growing domestic demand. Federal infrastructure projects, such as the construction of liquid hydrogen plants, wind farms, and other green energy initiatives, were projected to require significant steel imports, further justifying the policy. The impact on the Canadian steel industry has been profound. Steel producers who were once reliant on the US market for sales have found new opportunities at home. The Hamilton Steel Belt, once dependent on exports, now faces the prospect of sustained demand from government-backed projects. This has been a boon for Canadian workers, with unions such as the United Steelworkers praising the new direction as a guarantee for job security. But while the move has been hailed as a win for Canadian steelworkers, it has added to the economic tension between Canada and the US. This shift in policy was not entirely unforeseen. The seeds for this change were planted 3 years ago when the US imposed tariffs on steel and aluminum, ostensibly to combat its growing trade deficit. At that time, Canada responded by imposing retaliatory tariffs on US products such as whiskey and lawnmowers. However, Ottawa refrained from taking more drastic steps, preferring to wait for the right moment. That moment arrived when the tariffs on steel imports made Canadian exports financially untenable. In an unexpected twist, Canada flipped the script on President Trump's trade policies, redirecting steel production to meet its own needs. At the core of this decision lies the belief that Canada's steel industry can thrive on domestic demand alone. According to government projections, the shift away from exports could open the door for up to 2.5 million tons of steel to be absorbed by the Canadian market by 2026. The demand for steel in Canada has been on the rise, driven by a combination of public sector investments and increased interest in green technologies. Projects such as wind turbines and hydrogen plants, which require vast amounts of steel, could keep Canadian steel mills humming for years to come. However, while Canada may be reaping the benefits of this strategy, the US is feeling the pain. American manufacturers that were once able to source steel from their northern neighbor are now facing higher costs, as the 30% tariff imposed by Trump drives up the price of Canadian steel. In Michigan, just across the border from Windsor, the impact is immediate. US automakers like Ford and Stellantis, which rely on Canadian steel for their production lines, now find themselves paying a premium for raw materials. The price increase could result in higher vehicle prices and, potentially, a drop in sales. Analysts predict that the price of certain vehicles could rise by as much as $1,800, which could dampen demand and ultimately affect the profitability of US automakers. The political ramifications of this shift are already being felt in Washington. Some US politicians, particularly those representing the Great Lakes region, have criticized Canada's decision, accusing it of creating an unfair export barrier. There are concerns that this will exacerbate the impact of Trump's tariffs, leading to job losses in US steel industries. However, Canada's approach appears to be within the boundaries of international trade law, as it is not providing subsidies or direct financial aid to its steel industry, but merely prioritizing domestic consumption. In the face of these tensions, Canada has positioned itself as a key player in the green energy transition. By investing in electric arc furnaces that produce steel with a lower carbon footprint, Canada is not only bolstering its domestic steel industry, but also making strides towards meeting its climate targets. This focus on sustainability could provide Canada with a competitive advantage in the global steel market, especially as Europe's Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, CBAM, comes into play. As the US struggles to pass its own carbon regulations, Canada's green steel could serve as a valuable export commodity, further strengthening its position in global trade. The question remains, will this new approach be sustainable? As Canada looks to the future, it must balance the need for increased domestic steel production with the challenges posed by rising prices and logistical constraints. The Canadian Construction Association has already warned that price increases could slow down some infrastructure projects, while Ottawa is working on initiatives to encourage steel recycling to mitigate these costs. This phased export strategy, which ensures that high-quality steel products can still be sold to international markets when there is surplus, appears to be a pragmatic solution for the short term. This new chapter in Canada's steel story is far from over. The country has successfully capitalized on the opportunity created by Trump's tariffs, transforming what was once a trade burden into a chance for economic growth and environmental progress. The US, on the other hand, is left to grapple with the unintended consequences of its protectionist policies, and the long-term effects of Canada's move remain to be seen. As Canada charts a new course for its steel industry, the economic and political consequences extend far beyond its borders. Ottawa's decision to prioritize domestic steel consumption is not merely a response to President Trump's tariffs, but a calculated move to strengthen its position both in the North American market and globally. The Canadian government has used this moment to both shield its workers from the volatility of global trade and to push forward its green energy agenda, creating a situation where the policy shifts may have long-term repercussions for trade relationships and industrial dynamics. Canada's newfound focus on domestic steel is not just about compensating for lost export revenues. The shift reflects a broader trend in Canada's industrial strategy, one that seeks to reduce its dependence on US markets while simultaneously positioning itself as a leader in environmentally sustainable industries. The decision to dedicate steel production to domestic infrastructure projects, such as renewable energy initiatives and clean technology investments, is a major part of Ottawa's strategy to meet its climate targets and fulfill its green energy commitments. The government's commitment to green steel is already yielding tangible results. The Canadian steel industry, which accounts for 7% of the nation's carbon emissions, is undergoing a transformation with the help of electric arc furnaces, EAFs. EAFs, which use electricity to melt scrap metal rather than traditional blast furnaces, are significantly cleaner and more energy efficient, cutting emissions per unit of steel by nearly half. This investment aligns with Canada's ambitious climate goals, which include a 40% reduction in emissions by 2030 and achieving net zero emissions by 2050. Through this shift, Canada is making strides to decouple its steel industry from high-emission processes, while also laying the groundwork for future international trade in low-carbon steel. The use of electric arc furnaces is also part of a broader strategy to reduce the carbon footprint of Canada's steel industry, which has been a critical step in responding to the emerging global trend toward carbon border taxes. The European Union's Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, CBAM, could be a major boon for Canadian steel if it can position its products as low-carbon alternatives to traditional steel. Canada's renewable energy sources, such as hydroelectric power, are a key factor in this transition, as they offer a cleaner way to power steel production compared to coal-fired energy sources used in many other countries. As the EU implements stricter carbon controls, Canada could seize an opportunity to export low-carbon steel, which would be exempt from additional taxes under CBAM, further enhancing its trade prospects. However, not all parties are thrilled with Canada's shift toward domestic steel prioritization. In Washington, the steel industry's reaction has been mixed. While the U.S. steel lobby might applaud the notion of a more competitive, self-reliant steel industry in North America, the U.S. automotive industry is far less enthusiastic. Major automakers like Ford and Stellantis, which rely heavily on Canadian steel to manufacture vehicles in Michigan, now face rising costs due to the 30% tariff imposed on imported steel. The cost increase has already been felt on the assembly lines, with the price of vehicles set to rise by as much as $1,800 per unit. This price hike could have broader consequences. As automakers are forced to absorb the higher costs, consumers may be less willing to purchase new vehicles, especially as interest rates remain high. Reduced sales could, in turn, result in fewer shifts at U.S. manufacturing plants and a decrease in the number of jobs available in industries that depend on cheap steel imports. The impact of higher production costs has already been felt in Michigan, where U.S. workers could lose out, as Canada's protectionist strategy leads to more competitive pricing for its domestic producers. The ripple effect of Canada's steel policy could undermine President Trump's original protectionist intent, as higher steel prices threaten to undermine job growth in the U.S. manufacturing sector. Moreover, the U.S. energy industry is also bracing for higher costs, due to Canada's steel prioritization. The Alberta Oil Sands project, which requires vast amounts of pipeline steel, has been hit by higher prices on steel pipes. The U.S. tax wall on steel exports has raised the costs of supplying these materials to Canada, resulting in new challenges for U.S. companies that have long relied on cheaper steel imports. In response, Canada has mandated that all energy and water infrastructure projects funded by the federal government must use domestic steel pipes. This move has been seen as a strategic maneuver to ensure that Canada's domestic steel industry continues to thrive, while further limiting U.S. access to a market it once dominated. While these changes are a blow to U.S. industries that depend on Canadian steel, the situation is not as dire as it may initially appear. Ottawa's move is not a complete ban on steel exports. It is a reorganization of the steel supply chain, prioritizing domestic consumption while still allowing for select exports. High-quality steel products such as electric vehicle components and specialized armor plates will continue to flow to international markets. However, this will only happen once domestic demand has been met, creating a phased export strategy that ensures Canada's industrial needs are addressed first. This shift also has implications for U.S.-Canada relations. While Canada's action is an economic maneuver, it is also a political statement. Ottawa's decision to prioritize domestic steel sends a clear message. Canada will no longer be subject to the whims of U.S. trade policy. If the U.S. were to dismantle its tariff wall, Canada would be willing to return to previous export levels. However, the leverage Canada has gained from its new steel policy could enable it to negotiate better trade terms with the U.S. in the future. The political ramifications are clear. U.S. lawmakers, particularly those from the Great Lakes region, have voiced concerns that Canada's move is a form of protectionism designed to unfairly advantage Canadian industries. However, legal experts argue that Canada's approach is within the boundaries of international trade law, as it is not providing subsidies to its steel industry, but merely prioritizing domestic consumption. By keeping its production and export strategy flexible, Canada is positioning itself as a more resilient and adaptable trading partner, able to adjust quickly to the shifting tides of global trade. As Canada stands at the crossroads of economic opportunity and political tension, the long-term effects of its steel prioritization strategy will play out on multiple fronts. For Ottawa, the decision to focus on domestic steel consumption is not just a tactical response to U.S. tariffs, but a foundational shift that could reshape Canada's position in the global economy. While the immediate fallout has been disruptive to U.S. industries, particularly automotive manufacturing and energy, the broader implications for North American trade, Canada's environmental goals, and its relations with global trade partners are profound. The strategy of prioritizing domestic steel consumption is deeply tied to Canada's broader goals of industrial diversification and economic resilience. By reducing reliance on the U.S. market, Canada is sending a signal that it is not content with being a supplier to the American manufacturing machine. Instead, it is taking steps to foster a more self-sufficient economy, with domestic demand for steel driven by both public and private sector projects. From infrastructure development to the burgeoning green energy sector, the need for steel in Canada is on an upward trajectory, ensuring that Canadian mills will not fall idle in the face of export restrictions. One of the most critical components of this strategy is Canada's transition to low-carbon steel production. The shift to electric arc furnaces, EAFs, is part of a concerted effort to meet the country's climate goals and fulfill its commitments under the Paris Agreement. As a major emitter of carbon dioxide, the steel sector has long been a target for Canada's Climate Action Plan. By investing in EAFs, which recycle scrap metal rather than using virgin ore, Canada is reducing the carbon intensity of its steel production. This transformation could help Canada not only meet its domestic climate goals, such as achieving a 40% reduction in emissions by 2030, but also position itself as a leader in the production of green steel for the global market. The European Union's Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, or CBAM, could be a key factor in this global strategy. As the EU seeks to implement a carbon border tax to prevent carbon leakage, Canadian steel could benefit from its relatively low carbon production processes. This gives Canada a competitive advantage over other steel producers, such as China, whose steel is produced using more carbon-intensive methods. With the EU's carbon border tax set to increase the cost of high-carbon steel imports, Canada's green steel could become a preferred choice for European buyers, looking to meet stricter environmental regulations. This shift not only benefits the Canadian steel industry, but also reinforces Ottawa's commitment to sustainability. Moreover, Canada's green steel strategy plays into broader geopolitical dynamics. The shift to low-carbon production methods strengthens Canada's ties to the EU. At the same time, Canada is moving away from its traditional reliance on the US market, opening the door for new trade relationships. As Washington continues to push a protectionist agenda, Canada has found ways to leverage its low-carbon steel production to create new export opportunities. The Canadian government's investment in clean technology and green infrastructure, including wind turbines and hydrogen plants, further underscores its commitment to a sustainable future. Ottawa has mandated that 60% of the components for onshore wind turbines must be sourced domestically, which directly translates into an increase in steel demand. In the coming years, this demand is expected to grow exponentially, ensuring that Canada's steel mills remain at full capacity. This focus on sustainability not only helps reduce emissions, but also offers new economic opportunities, particularly in the renewable energy sector. In the short term, however, the focus on domestic consumption has caused tensions with the US. The Trump administration's protectionist tariffs have backfired in ways that were not anticipated, creating a situation where Canadian workers and manufacturers stand to benefit, while US companies face higher costs. The automotive industry, particularly in Michigan, is especially vulnerable to these price hikes. The rising cost of steel, combined with already high interest rates, could lead to a slowdown in vehicle sales, particularly in the pickup truck segment. This in turn could lead to reduced working hours for US factory workers and a slowdown in manufacturing output. The unintended consequence of Trump's tariffs is a scenario in which US protectionism undermines the competitiveness of its own manufacturing sector. Looking ahead, Canada's steel strategy will continue to evolve in response to both domestic and international pressures. The government has already taken steps to mitigate potential price increases by introducing measures to encourage steel recycling. By offering tax rebates for scrap steel recycling, Ottawa is ensuring that the supply of steel remains abundant and affordable, even as demand for domestic steel increases. These measures help maintain a balance between supply and demand, preventing price spikes from stifling Canada's industrial growth. On the global stage, Canada's strategy may also help diversify its trade relationships, with Europe and other regions looking to transition to low-carbon economies. Canada's green steel could become a key export product. The country's access to clean, renewable energy sources such as hydroelectric power gives it a competitive edge in the production of green steel. In this way, Canada is positioning itself not only as a key player in North American trade, but also as an influential actor in the global steel market. In conclusion, Canada's decision to prioritize domestic steel consumption in the wake of President Trump's tariffs has far-reaching implications for both the US and Canada. While the US may face short-term challenges due to rising steel prices, Canada is strategically positioning itself for long-term economic success. By investing in green steel and focusing on domestic demand, Canada is creating a more resilient, sustainable economy. In the process, Ottawa has turned a trade challenge into an opportunity, strengthening its industrial base while contributing to global climate goals. The outcome of this bold strategy remains to be seen, but Canada's move is a testament to the country's ability to adapt and thrive in the face of shifting geopolitical and economic dynamics. As the world watches this unfolding trade drama, one thing is certain: Canada has redefined the rules of the game, and the US may soon have to follow suit. Whether this strategy will pay off in the long run, or whether the pressure from Washington will force a reversal remains to be seen. But Canada has certainly made its move, and it is a move with far-reaching implications for both its economy